start off, what is zoning? Zoning provides both the rights and the limitations on use of a property. Zoning typically addresses the land uses, development standards, which is the quality of development, and also approval procedures. The City of Albuquerque's zoning code was crafted to implement city policies and also to protect public welfare. Next slide. And our planning system has two main components. The first one is the comprehensive plan, and the second is the integrated development ordinance. So the comprehensive plan is when we meet with people and talk to individuals and businesses and groups about how we want our city to grow. So this covers where we want to grow, areas we want to protect, and also how to measure progress to see if we're achieving our goals. The comprehensive plan has policies that direct us to focus our growth in centers and corridors, and we have a tool called Areas of Change and Consistency, and this is a map that kind of tracks with the centers and corridors, and it tells us where we want to change and emphasize growth and where we want to protect and keep the same. And so I'd like to point out all of our parks and open space, all of our single family neighborhoods and houses are all designated as an area of consistency. And so those are the areas where we want to keep stability. The integrated development ordinance, this is our regulatory system. They're the rules and the zoning system and how we implement our comprehensive plan. Some of the tools that we use in this is the centers and corridors. Those are rules that apply differently, and depending on if you're in a center or corridor or an area of consistency, there's unique rules for overlay zones and other special places. Also citywide, we have rules that talk about transitions between different types of uses like residential and non-residential, and transitions between development and open space and sensitive lands. Next slide. So this slide gives us an overview of how the IDO, our zoning code, is organized, and there are four major parts. The first two parts are grouped together under the purple bar, and those are the zones. There's both the base zones like R1 and RT, and then there's also the overlay zones, and those are special places that basically carried forward rules from historic plans or sector plans. The second group is our use regulations, and so that section tells us what uses can be used in each zone, any standards that are related to those uses, and also in that area, in that section, there are specific mapped areas where certain uses are or are not allowed. On the other side, I just saw in the chat, Michaela pointed out that there is a link to our integrated development ordinance. And so you can see this is a simplified version of the table of contents. And then also below that, there's a link to our zoning map. And this is an interactive map. And each of the colors are coded in this presentation to the little buttons across the bottom. So button 3 corresponds to the overlay zones, button 4 corresponds to the uses, button 5 corresponds to the development standards, and so on. Going back to the colored bars, the next one is development standards. This one covers the quality of development. So how good does development have to be? And this is This kind of covers like how tall buildings can be, what the setbacks are, how much landscaping is required for a property. The next section, the final one we're going to talk about, is administration and enforcement. So these are the processes that you would need to go through to get an approval to do a new development or redevelop your property. Next slide. Okay, and another major goal of our zoning is to protect special places. So this includes neighborhoods, open spaces, geological features, views of different elements in the city, such as the Sandia Mountains, the volcanoes, the escarpment, and the bosque. And These protections are basically scattered throughout the IDO. They're found in overlay zones, in the allowable uses, development standards, and in the processes. I'd like to also point out on the other side of the slide, you can find these in Table 1 and Table 2. This is a part of the table of contents in the IDO. The Table 1 is all of the IDO regulations in the order that they occur. So all the uses are together and then all the development standards are together. And Table 2 is the same content. It's just organized by area. So if you know which area you're in, you can just look it up alphabetically in Table 2 and see all the unique rules that would apply to that area. And then again, the map, what's really nice about this interactive map is that when you can look up your address, and then when you zoom to it, if you turn all the layers on, you can just click once on your property and cycle through all of the special rules that apply to that property. So that's just a really helpful thing to help if you want to do something, to make a change with your property or develop some vacant land. This really helps you figure out like what rules apply to that property. Next slide, please. Okay, so small area protections. There's a map in the screen, and it shows all of the small mapped areas that are an overlay zone. And so we have different types of overlay zones. The first is character protection. So those are neighborhoods with a unique character that needed special rules. There's historic protection overlay zones. These are more in the central core of the city, and they had an adopted overlay protecting that historic character. There's also view protection overlay zones and an airport, well, 2 airport protection overlay zones. Next slide, please. This slide has a list of a list of all the areas where the small area text amendments are proposed. And I know some of you in the meeting today came here to learn more about a specific small area. And if anyone wanted to step away from this main meeting and talk to a few of our staff members, if you only have a question about your small area and what's changing and how that impacts your property, then please just raise your hand or turn on your screen and wave at us, and we can make a breakout room, and you can go and ask those questions and come back to the meeting when you're done, or if you want, we'll have time at the end. Okay, so we're toggling between small area and citywide, and this one's interesting because this is a small area protection that does apply citywide. And so just to explain what that is all about is this is a change that applies to all historic protection overlay zones. Those are shown in the little blue outlines on this small map. They're mostly all in the older part of town, central area, and then along near University. So this change applies to all current historic protection overlay zones, as well as any new ones that are created in the future. You can find these by clicking in our map on button 3, and there's a checkbox where you can look at the historic overlays. Go ahead and do the next slide, please. So what this change proposes, there's the full text in the table at the bottom. I don't expect anyone to read all of these words on the slide. It's just really more for the purposes of we're posting this presentation online. So at a later time, if you want to look at this in more detail, this is just straight out of that spreadsheet of all the proposed changes. And I put them all on one slide just for everyone's convenience. What this change does is right now, if we are adopting or amending text to a historic protection overlay zone, the IDO says that would go to the Environmental Planning Commission before it goes to City Council. And so this is a little bit different than the way it worked when we had the H1 zone under the old zoning code. So what we're doing with this proposed change is reverting to that prior practice and having all adoption or amendment of HPO text go to the Landmark Commission, who are trained in historic preservation matters, and then it'll go on to the City Council. And I also wanted to point out that we are not proposing any changes to the other process of adopting standards and guidelines. So those are the technical standards. Those are still decided by the Landmarks Commission. And so this one has changes both in section 3-5, which is the historic overlay, and also in section 6, which is the procedure section of the IDO. Next slide, please. So, Sergio, could you get the next slide? Thank you. Okay, citywide protections related to allowable uses. So this is the next part 4 of the IDO. Many uses have standards that limit how that use can be conducted. And there are protections between uses of the same site, of the same type. And this is to avoid clustering of uses that might have negative impacts on an area, such as bail bonds or payday loan businesses. And there's also separations between certain uses in residential areas. And these include liquor sales, heavy manufacturing, and other uses that aren't appropriate right next to residential uses or major public open space. Next slide, please. When regulating land use, going back to the earlier slide, use of land is one of the constitutionally protected rights. What we have to do is balance protecting special places and then also incentivizing growth in the appropriate locations. And by providing those incentives for centers and corridors, that's how we are hoping to draw development pressure away from land that's right next to sensitive open space and residential neighborhoods. Next slide, please. So the first proposed change that pertains to uses is in the MXL zone, which is mixed use low intensity. There's a proposal to change a drive-through use. Right now it's conditional, so it would require a public hearing to get a conditional use approval, and this change would make it permissive accessory so that it could happen just by right in that zone, which is similar to some of the higher intensity zones. Next slide. This next change is about accessory dwelling units without a kitchen. In the townhouse zone, we're proposing a change to allow accessory dwelling units without a kitchen as permissive. And right now it's conditional. And as we were looking at the table, one thing I wanted to point out is that in the RT, which is residential townhouse zone, you can have more than one house. And you can also have an accessory dwelling unit with a kitchen. So the thought is that having one without a kitchen, which is generally less intensive, would be okay. There's also a change in the last line to strike unit from the dwelling temporary. And this technical word change would also allow a temporary dwelling to not have a kitchen. Next slide, please. Okay, cottage development. What this is where you can, on a larger property that's generally in between 1 and 2 acres, you can build slightly more dwellings than would be allowed by that zone if they are all limited in size, so under 1,000 square feet each. So the first change in this row shows that there's a proposal to allow cottage development anywhere citywide if it's on a lot that's a 1/4 acre or larger. So it's about 10,000 square feet is about a 1/4 acre. Right now, citywide, you need to have at least 1 acre. But if you're in an urban center, a Main Street or premium transit area, then you could do it on a lot that's 10,000 square feet. So this would expand that citywide. The second change, these are somewhat conflicting. The second change is for this to require a conditional use. And so that's kind of adding a process, but if the first change is adopted, then the second one would not be necessary. And then the third one would expand the 10,000 square foot allowance to all of the center and corridor types. And again, that wouldn't be necessary if the first one were adopted. But the second two are just different ways of slightly expanding that allowance, but in more limited fashion. Next slide, please. Okay, multifamily development. So this change generally applies to multifamily that is outside of centers and corridor locations. So it's the more suburban type locations in the city. These changes would require more landscaping. They allow more grasses, both turf and native grasses, and they require some of your usable open space to be provided at the ground level, unless you're near a park or open space. And so right now, all of your usable open space could be provided in patios or rooftop decks. And so this change kind of would make more like kind of playground areas and grassy areas allowed and required. Next slide. Also wanted to point out about that, sorry. There are other changes proposed to the building design. We'll cover that in part 5. Community residential facilities. This use is defined as housing for people and classes that are protected by the Fair Housing Act. The FHA prohibits regulations that treat a protected class any differently than any other residential use. And so this change would remove these two standards, one of which is a distance separation, and second is a maximum number per council district. And what that does is that ensures that we're compliant with FHA standards. Related to this one, we are also revising the group home use to remove reference to these community residential facilities. So that just makes it consistent with this change. Next slide, please. Light vehicle fueling station. So this change allows a gas canopy to count as part of your building. What this really impacts is center and corridor areas where there's a maximum front setback. And it also exempts gas stations from the requirement that you have 50% of a building located at the front property line. And as we've seen, gas stations sometimes don't even have a building or have a small building like towards the center of the site. And so we heard that wasn't really practical. This change also limits outdoor display prohibition to the urban center, Main Street, and premium transit areas. Next slide. Light vehicle sales and rental. Excuse me. Okay, so this change prohibits outdoor display and storage of vehicles in the center and corridor areas. This is consistent with the other change that that generally it's okay to have outdoor storage except in the center and corridor locations. Next slide. This is the last change to the uses, and all three of our cannabis related uses, which is a new use since our last update, which became effective at the beginning of November. All three of these changes are focused on that this use needs to be indoor. The first one is for retail sales, that any retail sales of cannabis products must be inside. Right now, the use retail can have some outdoor storage with the conditional use, and this would remove that ability. The second two are related to cultivation and manufacturing, and those require that they're inside unless a conditional use is approved. There are also some changes in the definition section that generally add consistency with the way the state regulates it. Right now, we just have medical marijuana allowed through the state permitting process, and we want to make sure that the city's definitions are consistent with their permitting process and definitions. Next slide. I'm going to take this opportunity to turn this over to Michaela. I am sick today, so I'm running out of steam and hoping that she'll be able to step in with a little more enthusiasm than I have right now.
Absolutely. Carrie,
Thank you.
Can you keep an eye on the door? I was on door duty and there have been people joining us as we go along, and maybe keep an eye on the chat as well. I'll ask for everybody's patience and goodwill as I'm kind of doing this on the fly. So here we go. In the development standards section are citywide rules as well as individualized rules that help require good transitions from one kind of development to another. The special rules for small places are mapped under button 5 on the IDO zoning map as well. Next slide, please. So one of the updates would add a type of sensitive land to the IDO, which is riparian area. It would also, there's another update that would allow residential lots near major public open space to consolidate more than would otherwise be required based on the contextual standards in Part 5. Next slide, please. In addition, there's an entirely new section proposed for 5.2 that would add requirements for site design that would respond to both climate, here our very sunny climate, as well as responding to geographic features. So again, this would go in Part 5.2 or Section 5.2, sensitive lands, where we'd ask that people really think about how to orient their buildings on the site to reduce the amount of solar gain in the summer, maximize it in the winter, and also respond to our great views of things like the sandias and our volcanoes. This would apply to, sorry, go backwards, I'm sorry. This would apply to multifamily development over 25 units and mixed use and non-residential development. Thanks, Serge. All right, a few new proposals based on some requests from the Open Space Advisory Board. In addition to adding the riparian area to sensitive lands, there would also be a requirement to use only kind of native landscaping for lots that abut arroyos. They've noticed that when people use species that aren't really native to Albuquerque, those can sometimes get into the arroyos and then become invasive species in downstream, basically. It would also require, these proposed changes would also require an additional 50-foot buffer on private land next to the sensitive lands within major public open space. So not all, so if two private properties were next to each other, this rule wouldn't kick in. But next to major public open space that has a sensitive land on it, so a riparian area, a floodplain, all the other kind of sensitive lands enumerated in the IDO, it would require an additional 50-foot buffer on top of what's already required in the IDO. Next slide. In terms of parking, there are kind of some just moving around of parts. So right now, parking is in the use table where it's accessory to other uses, and that's not really how we talk about parking anymore. So this proposal would move all of that content into the parking section of the IDO, where we actually look for it, where you might look for it. And another change that would require a slight change to where accessible parking is required, just to make it really clear that pretty much for anything other than single family, you are required to do accessible parking outside of a driveway area. Next slide, please. Minor change to the outdoor parking requirement that would reduce the amount of parking associated with outdoor dining. We've seen during COVID that outdoor dining is increasingly important. This would be an additional incentive to include outdoor dining because you don't have to save as much space on your site for parking. Hotel and motel parking, we noticed that hostels, which are really rented by bed and not by room, weren't contemplated in the IDO. And so this is an adjustment that would add or either by room or by bed, whichever is greater, to make sure that there's still adequate parking provided for hostels. Next slide, please. In addition, we've also heard in COVID more people using drive-throughs, and that means longer lines, and it sometimes means that those lines leave the site and get into the street where cars are stopped and cause accidents. So this proposed change would require more space on the site for what we call queuing, or for cars to line up for that drive-through. Next slide, please. Again, we saw a case where multifamily development was proposed next to an industrial activity. And while the IDO does require the industrial development to provide a buffer to any existing residential, the opposite wasn't true. And so this proposal would require multifamily development going in next to industrial to also provide a buffer on its site to provide that layer of protection between the residential use and the industrial development. Next slide, please. Slight adjustment to the walls section. Right now, the IDO talks about an adequate material is stucco over CMU, or concrete masonry unit block. We weren't sure whether we really intended everybody to have to stucco everything they did, and so this proposal would just allow concrete masonry unit, or those standard blocks, to be used. There is still the requirement in the IDO that kind of a higher level of quality is still required next to major public open space, next to public parks, and in anything that's street facing. In terms of lighting, this is a small adjustment we'd made to the 2019 IDO, but we didn't quite say where code enforcement's supposed to be facing when they take that measurement. So it's a just greater level of specificity proposed there. Next slide, please. There's a rather large addition to the multifamily building design standards. These would, again, kind of track a little bit with the climate responsiveness that I mentioned earlier. The intent of these proposed standards is really to help increase the amount of thoughtfulness about multifamily design, to allow for some architectural creativity, but still create really interesting human-scaled multifamily development. There's also changes proposed to the uses that Carrie, the use-specific standards that Carrie mentioned, that would require a little bit more grass with multifamily developments, and a little bit more landscaping as well. Next slide, please.
I do want to point out at this time that that some of those multifamily design standards are still in flux, and So we're welcoming comments on those, and they're not quite final. Thank you.
All right. This slide for joint premises signs is really supposed to match what actually happens in the real world. That if you have a shopping center site with multiple stores, it allows actually all those stores to have just one site, whereas the regulations as they're written today inadvertently required spacing of joint premises signs in a way that wasn't really intended. So this is supposed to clean that up. Next slide, please. Staff noticed that glare was mentioned in one section, but wasn't really defined and wasn't really given an enforceable measure. This particular section would be moved into the buffering and screening section of the IDO and really given some teeth. So really just an intent to make this glare section enforceable. Next section, or next slide. Next section too. Small area changes. Carrie, do you want to take it back or do you want me to keep going?
Yeah, that was a nice break. Thank you. I'll pick up. I got a little more ibuprofen in me. Hopefully that starts working soon. Okay, so in the development standards, there are a handful of changes that do apply within small areas. And so the first one is in the downtown center. There is a change about contextual standards that in an area of consistency that the changes that you sorry, I guess I'm not as clear as I thought it was. It's really trying to encourage infill in that downtown core and allowing that infill to happen on lots that are 10,000 square feet or less. The second change is about parking structure and standards in the East Downtown area. That's the character protection and historic protection overlay areas. Those just clarify that sector plan had a street wall element, and these changes clarify that it could either be a low street wall or it could be the parking garage wall that's kind of at the street edge. And the purpose of that is really to help define the pedestrian realm. And so it's a pretty minor change. The third one is in the downtown center. This is a new thing that recently rooftop signs are allowed in the East Downtown area, which is the area in between downtown and I-25. And so this change would extend that allowance to apply within the downtown center and within approximately one block of that downtown center. And the rooftop signs, there's design limitations that it can't just be a big billboard. It has to be kind of cut out individual letters. So that was determined to be an appropriate kind of historical sign type in that part of town. And then the last one is in the Volcano Mesa area, there was a prohibition against electronic signs in the sector plans. And so when we were looking more closely at that area, we realized that electronic sign prohibition was left out. And so we wanted to bring that back forward. Next slide, please. So going back to the intent of the zoning code, linking the citywide policies and the vision for where we want growth and change to the implementing tools. Our IDO, we took advantage of kind of rethinking our whole zoning system to make a closer tie between policies and the regulation. So in the map, you can see all the different center and corridor locations identified. And the the zoning code has different allowances and entitlements, and generally it's less parking and taller buildings are allowed in centers and corridor areas. And in exchange, more walkable site design is required, and more attractive buildings and more attention on the streetscapes required. Next slide, please. At the beginning, I talked about table 1 and 2. Those were identifying all the small areas where there's different rules. There's another table, table 3, and this summarizes all of the different rules that apply based on what center or corridor type that property is within. And so if you know a property is within a certain center or corridor type, you can look at the columns on this table. Otherwise, if you are interested in a particular use or development standard, those are all in the rows. So you can actually in the IDO click on either the title or the subsection, and it will take you to that regulation to review. Next slide, please. Again, we are trying to strike a balance with this. We're balancing community input, and this is kind of moving into the process section of the presentation. And what IDO has implemented is more communication earlier in the project development process, and then in exchange, a more streamlined approval process than some sector plans had. And so that's more administrative review of smaller projects. One thing to point out is the intent is to get the rules right and to continually look at them, like this annual update. This is going to happen every year, and make sure that the rules are right and they're protecting the things that we want to protect. And if they're not, then this is the time right now to look at them and make changes to them to make sure that we are implementing our citywide goals and visions. The other thing that we want to look at is when we start seeing a lot of exceptions and variance requests, then we'd like to kind of look at what's happening and why that is, and see if that a rule needs to change, or if many people just don't like following the rules and need exceptions. So we're trying to kind of look at that balance again between protecting places and incentivizing growth and things happening where we want them to. Next slide. So this is a summary of the table that tells us how a project is reviewed and approved. This is called the Summary of Development Review Procedures. And in this table, it is a summary for this presentation, but each of the rows, those are different application types. And at the top, the ones in green, those are the smallest applications. They're often like one building, or a small number of multifamily, and those are administrative approvals. And if we shift our attention to the columns, those kind of show what notice is needed, what types of public meetings, and who makes the decision on that case. And so the further we get down in the table, the bigger the request is, and so the more notice and the more meetings are required. The yellow section highlighted, those are decisions requiring a public meeting or a hearing. There's generally more notice needed, and the approval bodies mostly look at the IDO rules. The last section is policy decisions. And these are kind of the biggest decisions. We're amending our rules, or we're adopting new text in the IDO, or for new text for small areas. And so for these, we look at the policies and decide them on a case-by-case basis. And some of these go all the way up to City Council, or all of these go up to City Council to decide. Next slide, please. This kind of shows that same content in a different way, more schematically, showing that the smallest projects have the least flexibility, but then the most predictability. So those have to follow the rules, and if they don't, then they get bumped up into the next category, which is projects that require a public meeting or a hearing. And so there's more notice required for these, and we decide the rules every year when we're doing this annual update to make sure that those are the right decision rules and the right hearing and approval process. In this case, we noticed that the landmarks needed to review changes to historic protection overlay zones. So we made a change there to make sure that the appropriate review body is deciding those cases. The last one is the discretionary decisions that require a public hearing. And these all require lots of pre-application notice and pre-application meetings. Next slide, please. Okay, so general procedures. The first change, this is saying that when an applicant notices the neighborhood associations, this is approximately a 45-day period of sending out notice and offering a meeting that happens before we will accept the application. So that meeting would have had to occur before, and those are all facilitated meetings now. We kind of put like a bookend that it can't be any more than 90 days. So it has to basically be at least 45 days before, but not more than 90. And this is really to make sure that the information provided in those meetings is current and relevant to that application. And the next change is adding a little specificity for how the expiration of site plans are processed. So this is a little bit of a technical thing that I'm probably going to have trouble explaining, but when a site plan expires, I don't know, Michaela, can you jump in? I'm not getting this one.
Sure, absolutely. So right now the IDO says that you can, if you get a site plan approved and you no longer intend to build what you got approved, right now there's a couple options in the IDO for how to do that. One is to ask for an expiration of your site plan, so that, you know, right now the IDO says if you go to EPC and you get a site plan, you have 7 years that it's good for. So you could ask them to expire it early. That's kind of a weird concept. So we just said, made some text changes that basically say when you ask for that expiration, what you're actually asking for is a repeal of your site plan, and that we process that using the major amendment processes in the IDO. So again, it's not that it's a new thing. We're just kind of connecting a few dots and making the language consistent in the document.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, next slide. Okay, decisions requiring a public hearing. So this change is also related to the historic preservation overlay zones, and they require that walls and fence variance requests, either that are approved by the zoning hearing examiner or by the EPC, they both have to go to the historic preservation planner first for review, and then it carries on through that process. Right now, I think, route them through that process anyways. This just basically codifies that's the process for all of them, and it's required. Next slide. Development Review Board. This allows the DRB to delegate authority for administrative review for particular standards. And this change is really that the DRB reviews kind of larger site plans, and then for, say, like a shopping center site, each building that occurs on that site after the main layout and site design is created, the DRB felt that it was appropriate for those to go through an administrative review process, and thus authorizes them to delegate that administrative review after they do the major subdivision and site layout. And the second change gives the DRB a little bit of discretion in their authority to review whether the site plan mitigates significant adverse impacts on adjacent development and open space. And so it also lists some areas about wall height, the way that the access and driveway is laid out, the way that the landscape is designed, as ways of mitigating any impact that might happen on an abutting residential or open space property. Next slide, please. Civil enforcement. This recent amendment that became effective at the beginning of November did a big change, and that was making our zoning code a civil code so that we could go through a civil process instead of a criminal process to do code enforcement. And so this is a really big and a really great thing because our code enforcement staff had to go to court with other cases like DUIs and like serious robbery cases, and they were talking about weeds and litter. And so the courts kind of didn't have much patience for that. So making it a civil enforcement code, we can have several steps in between, and also having kind of the city administer our own hearings and issue fines and penalties. So what this change does is we noticed that there was some conflict between the independent hearing office ordinance and IDO, and the full text, it's pretty lengthy, so it's in an exhibit. That's just basically removing conflict between two sections of our code of ordinances so that they're consistent. Next slide, please. In the 2020 update, there are a lot of minor changes to these definitions that are all listed here. Some of them I've already spoken about. A lot of these are tied to earlier amendments, like when we would look at setbacks, we noticed the porch definition needed a little bit of tweaking. When we looked at the auto-oriented uses, outdoor display needed a little tweaking. So these are all kind of minor changes, and they're itemized in our proposed list of changes. Some of the bigger ones are related to cluster development, common open space, and food truck courts. And we can kind of get into more detail about those in the one-on-one sessions after we break up from this main group. Next slide, please. So this is a conclusion. I'll try to wrap it up real quick so that we can kind of break out and have one-on-one discussion. So we've published the list of annual updates for this year. This is a public meeting that that is meant to give you an overview of all these changes. And the next step is the EPC, the Environmental Planning Commission. So that hearing's on Thursday, January 21st, starting at 8:30 in the morning. After that, it'll go to the the Land Use Planning and Zoning Subcommittee of Council, and then to full council. So the annual updates to the IDO is one thing we're doing. We're also starting the community planning area assessments next spring. And there's more info on our website. I'm not going to get into detail on that. There are also council planning projects that can happen, and other ways to kind of look in more detail at the rules to make sure that we are getting the rules right and having the right rules we need to implement our comp plan policies and goals. Next slide. The timeline. So we've had the small area meetings. This is the annual update. We've submitted, gosh, we're already at the end of this timeline. I didn't update it. So that's January 21st, 2021.